I'll do anything!
You should have thought of that before.
Set a trap. Chapter 1, The Hollow Zero. I spent 45 years of my life working in the suffocating heat of a steel mill. Every drop of sweat, every aching muscle was for one single purpose. Family. I saved every spare dollar, denying myself even the simplest luxuries, just to build a safety net for the people I loved. I drove a beat-up truck for 20 years and packed my own lunches every single day. It was a hard life, but it built a nest egg of exactly $450,000. It wasn't billionaire wealth, but to a man like me, it was a mountain of security. I kept it quiet, tucked away in a private account that only my late wife and I knew about. I never wanted my family to rely on my money instead of their own hard work. Or so I thought. My name is Elias Vance, and I am 72 years old. Most people look at me and see a frail, forgetful old man who just wants to be left alone with his crossword puzzles. My grandson, Caleb, was exactly one of those people. Caleb was 24, wore designer clothes he couldn't afford, and drove a leased sports car that screamed desperation. My daughter, Nora, raised him to believe the world owed him a living on a silver platter. She spoiled him rotten, making excuses every time he failed a class, quit a job, or asked for another handout. I loved my grandson, but I wasn't blind to the venomous snake he was becoming. I just never expected that snake to bite the hand that occasionally fed him. I remember the exact moment Caleb walked into my house 2 weeks ago. He had that fake, charming smile plastered across his face. He brought a cheap bottle of wine and told me he just wanted to spend some quality time with his grandpa. I should have known better. Every time Caleb showed up, he wanted something. Usually, it was a few $100s to cover a credit card bill or fix his flashy car. But this time, he didn't ask for a dime. He just wanted access to my Wi-Fi and my home office. I watched him sitting on my vintage leather couch, typing away on his laptop, pretending to look for a new job. In reality, he was hunting for my passwords. He was digging through my digital life, looking for the key to my vault. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping my black coffee, waiting for the mailman to drop off my monthly bank statement. I still prefer paper over digital, a habit Caleb used to mock me for endlessly. When I tore open the envelope, my heart stopped dead in my chest. The numbers on the page didn't make any sense at all. Where there should have been $450,000, there was only a chilling hollow zero. $0.00. I rubbed my eyes, thinking my old vision was playing cruel tricks on me. I grabbed my reading glasses and stared at the paper until the black ink blurred into a smudge. It wasn't a printing mistake. The money was gone, 45 years of broken bones and blistered hands wiped out in a single wire transfer. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. I called the bank immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. The representative on the phone sounded sympathetic but confused by my distress. She told me the transfer was authorized online, using my personal security questions and my exact passwords. Only one other person in the world had access to the lockbox where I kept that information. My daughter Nora had the spare key for medical emergencies. But Nora wouldn't do this. She was naive and overly protective, but definitely not a thief. Then a sickening realization hit me like a runaway freight train. Caleb had spent hours helping me set up my new computer last week, asking casual, innocent-sounding questions. He asked about my first pet, the street I grew up on, and my mother's maiden name. When I told him the name of my childhood dog, I practically gave him the combination to the safe. I had thought we were finally bonding after years of distance. I was an absolute fool. He didn't just rob me, he manipulated me with a warm smile on his face. The betrayal stung worse than any physical pain I had ever endured in the steel mill. He took my life's work, my security, and my dignity, thinking I would just roll over and cry about it. He thought I was just a weak old man who wouldn't know how to fight back against the modern world. But Caleb made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He only stole the Decoy account. He didn't know about the real fortune I had quietly amassed through decades of smart real estate investments, and he certainly didn't know about the trap I had set years ago, just in case someone ever tried to cross me. I put the phone down, and the suffocating panic in my chest slowly morphed into something else entirely. Cold, calculated, and absolute rage. If my grandson wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, I was going to teach him exactly how to lose. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It was time to call Marcus, my old friend and the most ruthless estate lawyer in the state. The game had just begun, and Caleb had no idea he was already in checkmate. Chapter 2, The Decoy and the Wire. Marcus's office smelled like expensive mahogany, aged leather, and old secrets. He was a man who made his living destroying arrogant people in unforgiving courtrooms. When I walked through his heavy oak doors, he took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't bother with small talk or polite pleasantries. I dropped the bank statement directly onto his pristine glass desk like a loaded weapon. Marcus picked it up, his sharp gray eyes scanning the hollow zero at the bottom of the page. He didn't gasp or show shock because men like Marcus only deal in cold, hard facts. "Who did it, Elias?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous.
Well,
I sat down heavily in the leather chair opposite him and spoke the name that tasted like ash in my mouth: Caleb. Marcus leaned back, steepling his fingers together as a dark, knowing smile crept onto his weathered face. He had warned me about Caleb years ago, calling him a parasite waiting for the host to weaken. I hated admitting that he was right, but pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. "He took the bait, Marcus," I said, leaning forward so he could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. "Every last penny of the 450,000. Marcus chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that echoed in the quiet, dimly lit room. "He actually thinks he got away with your life savings, doesn't he?"
I
I nodded slowly, letting the reality of my grandson's monumental stupidity sink in. What Caleb didn't know was that the account he drained wasn't a standard, run-of-the-mill checking account. It was a heavily monitored, restricted trust fund specifically designed to trigger a financial tripwire. 10 years ago, when I realized Caleb was developing a taste for things he didn't earn, I completely restructured my assets. I moved the real fortune, the $8 million I made from quietly flipping commercial real estate, into an impenetrable blind trust. The account Caleb hacked was nothing more than a decoy, seeded with just enough money to look convincing to a greedy kid. But more importantly, it was legally tied to a federal monitoring system designed to track elder financial abuse. By initiating that wire transfer across state lines to his offshore crypto wallet, he didn't just steal from you, Marcus explained, pulling out a thick yellow legal pad. He committed first-degree wire fraud and grand larceny in a single keystroke. And because you are over the age of 65, it automatically triggers a federal elder abuse enhancement. Caleb thought he was a genius hacker, outsmarting a dinosaur who still wrote physical checks at the grocery store. He had no idea he had just walked straight into a federal felony with a mandatory minimum prison sentence. "How long until the trap snaps shut?" I asked, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "The bank's fraud department is already processing the anomaly, but we are going to let him get comfortable," Marcus replied, his eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "Let him spend a little, let him sign contracts, let him leave a paper trail so thick a blind man could follow it." I agreed, knowing perfectly well that Caleb's immense arrogance would be his own spectacular undoing. Later that evening, my daughter Nora called me, practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. She told me Caleb had just landed a massive signing bonus from a secretive tech startup in Silicon Valley. She went on and on about how proud she was, completely oblivious to the fact that her precious son was a common thief.
well,
I listened to her praise him, my stomach churning with a toxic mix of pity and disgust. I logged onto my fake social media account and looked at Caleb's public profile to see the damage. He had already posted a picture of himself holding the keys to a brand new matte black Porsche 911. The caption read, "Hard work pays off, self-made grindset never settle." I stared at the glowing screen, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping my lips. He was spending stolen money on a depreciating asset, documenting his own federal crime for the entire world to see. He was building a fragile house of cards in the middle of a hurricane, and I was the one holding the wind. He even tagged a luxury real estate agent, hinting that he was closing on a downtown penthouse by the end of the week. I texted Marcus a screenshot of the car and the penthouse post, along with a single decisive word:
proceed.
Tomorrow, the bank would officially flag the funds, but that was only the very first phase of my revenge. I wasn't just going to take my money back, I was going to dismantle his entire fake life piece by piece. Caleb wanted to play the role of a wealthy, untouchable, self-made man. I was going to let him wear that heavy crown just long enough to feel the weight of it crush his skull. Chapter 3: The Last Supper. 2 days later, my daughter Nora invited me to a lavish celebratory dinner at the most exclusive, invite-only steakhouse in the city. She wanted the whole family to toast to Caleb's sudden, miraculous success in the tech industry. I put on my best worn-out tweed jacket, practiced my most confused, fragile smile in the mirror, and drove my rusty old truck to the restaurant. The valet looked at my truck like it was a piece of trash, but I just handed him the keys and walked inside. When I arrived at the private dining room, Caleb was already holding court at the head of a massive mahogany table.
Well,
He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than my first car, flashing a solid gold Rolex that aggressively caught the chandelier's light. He looked exactly like a billionaire tech CEO, but to me, he just looked like a pathetic clown wearing stolen clothes. Nora rushed over to hug me, her eyes shining with tears of absolute, unconditional pride. She whispered how relieved she was that Caleb had finally found his path, completely unaware that his path was a fast track to a federal penitentiary. I sat down quietly in the corner chair, playing the role of the proud, oblivious grandfather to absolute perfection. Caleb snapped his fingers at the waiter, a disgusting display of arrogance, and ordered 3 of the most expensive bottles of champagne on the menu without even glancing at the price tags. He stood up, raised his crystal glass, and toasted to the future, to hard work, and to seizing opportunities before they slip away. The sheer audacity of his hypocritical words made my blood boil, but my face remained a flawless mask of gentle, elderly ignorance. Halfway through the meal, Caleb leaned across the table, swirling his expensive red wine with a condescending smirk on his face. "You know, Grandpa, you really should let me help you invest your meager retirement money," he said loudly, making sure the whole table could hear his generous offer. "The world has changed so much, and keeping your cash in a dusty old bank account is just a guaranteed recipe for losing it all." I looked him dead in the eyes, holding his arrogant gaze for just a fraction of a second longer than a confused old man should. "You might be right, Caleb," I replied, my voice trembling perfectly on cue. "Sometimes money just seems to disappear into thin air when you aren't paying close enough attention." He chuckled dismissively, completely missing the lethal warning hidden beneath my words, and went right back to bragging about his new penthouse. He told everyone he was wiring the final down payment for the luxury downtown condo the very next morning. He bragged that the seller was desperate and that he was absolutely stealing the property for a fraction of its real value. Oh, the bitter, sickening irony of a thief bragging about stealing a house using stolen money. I quietly excused myself to the restroom, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and pulled out my encrypted phone. I sent a quick, precise text to Marcus, detailing Caleb's exact timeline for the real estate transaction. The target is wiring the real estate funds tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Marcus replied less than 10 seconds later with a single chilling sentence that made me smile in the mirror. "The federal financial freeze will execute at exactly 9:01 a.m.
On it.
The trap was fully armed, the poison bait was completely swallowed, and the countdown had officially begun. When I returned to the table, Caleb insisted on paying the massive $3,000 dinner bill, slapping down a sleek, heavy metal debit card linked directly to his offshore crypto account. The waiter took it with a deep, respectful bow, and Caleb beamed with the toxic pride of a man who thought he was a king. Nora leaned over and patted my wrinkled hand, telling me how wonderful it was to see our family finally thriving and financially secure. I just smiled and nodded, watching my grandson bask in his mother's blind, unwavering adoration. I knew deep in my bones that this would be the last peaceful meal he would ever eat as a free man. Let him enjoy the dry-aged steak, the vintage champagne, and the fragile illusion of immense power tonight. Because tomorrow morning, the only thing Caleb would be swallowing is the crushing, inescapable reality of his own destruction. Chapter 4: The 9:01 a.m. Freeze. The next morning, the sky over the city was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening a storm that was already brewing inside Marcus's office. I arrived at exactly 8:30, carrying 2 black coffees and a sense of absolute, unwavering resolve. Marcus was already at his desk, his computer monitors glowing with the secured portals of federal banking networks. He didn't greet me with a good morning, he just pointed to a blinking green light on the screen. "He's in the real estate office right now, Elias," Marcus said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee, imagining Caleb sitting in a plush leather chair across from his luxury broker. I could picture his smug, arrogant smile as he prepared to sign the final closing documents for his multi-million-dollar penthouse. He probably had his gold Rolex resting on the table, making sure everyone in the room knew exactly how important he was. At exactly 8:59, Marcus's fingers hovered over his keyboard like a concert pianist waiting for the conductor's cue. "The title company just requested the wire transfer for the down payment," Marcus announced, his eyes locked on the scrolling data. Caleb was authorizing the release of $200,000 of my stolen money. I watched the digital clock on the wall tick forward, the red numbers flashing with a slow, agonizing rhythm. 9 o'clock struck, and the initial authorization cleared Caleb's offshore crypto wallet, moving the funds into the domestic clearinghouse. He thought he had won. He thought the penthouse was his, the luxury life was secured, and the frail old man he robbed would never suspect a thing. But then the clock ticked to 9:01. Marcus hit the enter key, executing the federal freeze order we had prepared with the bank's fraud division. The blinking green light on the monitor instantly turned a violent, flashing crimson red. Code 404, Marcus whispered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. Asset freeze initiated under the Federal Elder Abuse and Wire Fraud Act. In that exact moment, miles away in a high-end real estate office, Caleb's world completely shattered. I later learned from the broker's assistant exactly how the spectacular humiliation unfolded. Caleb had just popped a complimentary bottle of champagne, handing a glass to the broker with a triumphant smirk. But the broker's computer suddenly chimed with a harsh, glaring error message. The wire transfer hadn't just bounced, it had been aggressively rejected by the Federal Reserve. The broker frowned, apologizing and asking Caleb if he perhaps used the wrong routing number. Caleb, dripping with arrogant confidence, laughed it off and pulled out his heavy metal debit card to cover the immediate escrow fees. He handed it over, completely unaware that the financial guillotine had already dropped. The broker swiped the card and the machine immediately beeped a loud, embarrassing decline. Caleb's face flushed a deep, angry red as he snatched the card back, blaming it on a bank security glitch for his massive wealth. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed his offshore account manager, demanding they fix the embarrassing mistake immediately. But there was no answer on the other end of the line, only an automated Federal Intercept message. This account has been seized pending a federal grand larceny investigation. The blood completely drained from Caleb's face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. He tried to log into his crypto wallet on his phone, but his password was rejected. He tried his backup credit cards, but the freeze had violently cascaded, locking every single financial avenue tied to his social security number. The luxury broker, realizing he was dealing with a fraud, quietly asked Caleb to leave the office immediately. Caleb stumbled out onto the rainy street, holding nothing but a useless metal card and the crushing weight of his own hubris. Back in the law office, Marcus closed his laptop with a sharp, satisfying snap. His accounts are frozen, his credit is destroyed, and the Porsche dealership will be notified of the fraudulent lease by noon, Marcus said. I looked out the window at the pouring rain, feeling a strange, heavy sense of peace wash over me. Caleb had wanted to steal my life savings to build a fake empire, but I had just turned his entire kingdom to ash in 60 seconds. Suddenly, my encrypted cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket, breaking the silence of the room. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was Caleb calling me in a state of absolute blind panic. I looked at Marcus, who simply nodded and leaned back in his chair to watch the show. I let it ring 3 times before I finally pressed the green button, ready to play my part one last time. Chapter 5: The Phone Call. I pressed the phone to my ear, making sure my hand was shaking just enough to make my voice sound frail. Hello? I answered, my tone dripping with the confused innocence of a lost, helpless old man. Grandpa, it's Caleb, he stammered, his voice cracking with a frantic, high-pitched desperation I had never heard before. He sounded like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the lethal click beneath his expensive shoes. Caleb, my boy, is everything all right? I asked, perfectly masking the cold, calculating satisfaction burning inside my chest. No, everything is wrong, he yelled, the background noise of the busy, rain-slicked street echoing through the speaker. Listen to me very carefully, Grandpa. Did you call the bank this morning? I let out a slow, trembling sigh, staring across the desk at Marcus, who was smiling like a hungry wolf watching its prey. Well, yes, Caleb, I had to, I replied, my voice quivering with fake, elderly anxiety. I got my paper statement in the mail yesterday and all my retirement money was completely gone. There was a sharp, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears in his head grinding as he tried to figure out how to manipulate his way out of this nightmare. Grandpa, listen to me, it's just a massive misunderstanding, Caleb lied, his voice dripping with fake, desperate reassurance. My tech company was trying to help secure your funds from hackers, and the bank's stupid system flagged it by mistake. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost impressive if it wasn't so incredibly pathetic. He actually thought he could still play me for an absolute fool. Oh dear, I whispered, sounding absolutely heartbroken and terrified. Is that what happened? Because the nice lady at the bank told me it looked like a malicious cyber attack. No, it's not an attack, Grandpa. Caleb pleaded, his breathing growing heavier and more erratic by the second. You just need to call the bank right now and tell them you authorized the transfer to my account. He was literally begging me to commit perjury to save his miserable, entitled skin. He wanted me to lie to the federal government so he could keep the luxury penthouse and the Porsche he bought with my blood and sweat. I pictured him standing in the freezing rain, his custom Italian suit getting soaked, the illusion of his success washing away into the gutter. Tell them it was a gift, Grandpa, or an early inheritance for my new company. Just tell them to lift the freeze immediately. His voice was escalating into a hysterical shriek, drawing the attention of strangers passing by on the street. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting him sweat in the agonizing silence for a few agonizing seconds. I thought about the 45 years in the steel mill, the burns on my arms, the aching in my spine. I thought about the arrogant smirk on his face at the steakhouse last night when he offered to manage my meager retirement. "I can't do that, Caleb," I said, my voice suddenly dropping the frail act just a fraction of an inch. "Why not?" he screamed, completely losing the polished billionaire persona he had spent stolen money to build. "Because the bank told me it was out of their hands," I replied calmly, savoring every single syllable. "They said because of the massive amount and because of my age, it was automatically forwarded to the federal authorities." I heard a sharp gasp on the other end of the line, like the wind had been violently knocked out of his lungs. The feds. Caleb choked out, the reality of his situation finally crushing his throat like a vice. "Yes, Caleb," I continued, twisting the knife with absolute surgical precision. "An incredibly polite FBI agent called me an hour ago to take my official statement regarding the cyber theft. I told them exactly what happened, and they promised me they would hunt down the ruthless hacker who stole my life savings. They said the penalty for wire fraud against a senior citizen carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary." Caleb didn't say a single word. The silence was absolute heavy and filled with the suffocating terror of a boy who finally realized he was playing a man's game. He realized that the helpless old man had just locked him inside a burning building and swallowed the only key.
Grandpa.
"Please," he finally whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, wet sob. "You have to tell them it was a mistake. You have to save me. They are going to ruin my life." I looked at Marcus, who tapped his heavy gold watch, signaling that the next phase of the demolition was already in motion. "I'm sorry, Caleb, but my memory just isn't what it used to be," I said, my voice turning ice cold and utterly devoid of mercy. "I have to go now. My morning crossword puzzle is waiting for me." I hung up the phone before he could utter another desperate plea, cutting off his only lifeline with a single, decisive click. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt, not a single drop of remorse for the grandson who tried to leave me with absolutely nothing. Right on cue, Marcus's computer chimed with a high-pitched notification from the asset recovery team. "The repo trucks have just been dispatched," Marcus announced, leaning back and crossing his arms with a satisfied smirk. "They are tracking the live GPS on his leased Porsche right now." Caleb was currently standing on a sidewalk, locked out of his stolen wealth, and about to lose his flashy getaway car in broad daylight. But the true masterpiece of this revenge wasn't just destroying Caleb's stolen finances. It was the inevitable, explosive confrontation with his mother, Nora, who was about to discover exactly who her precious son really was. Chapter 6: The Repo and the Reality. Caleb stood paralyzed on the rain-slicked sidewalk outside the luxury real estate office. His custom Italian suit was soaked, clinging to his shivering frame like a cheap, wet paper bag. He frantically swiped at his frozen phone screen, trying to call his mother, trying to call his fake tech friends, trying to call anyone who could save him. But every single call went straight to voicemail, leaving him entirely alone with the crushing weight of his federal felony. He stumbled toward his matte black Porsche 911, parked illegally in a loading zone, desperate to escape the scene of his humiliation. He just wanted to get inside the leather interior, lock the doors, and speed away to figure out a plan. But as he reached for the sleek door handle, a massive, heavy-duty tow truck suddenly roared around the corner, its yellow lights flashing aggressively in the gray morning light. The truck aggressively blocked the Porsche, tires screeching against the wet pavement. Two burly men jumped out of the cab, moving with the terrifying efficiency of professionals who dealt with angry rich kids every single day. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Caleb screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged toward the men. "That's my car, you can't touch that, I paid for it." The larger of the two men, wearing a thick canvas jacket and a bored expression, didn't even flinch. He pulled a laminated clipboard from his pocket and shoved it aggressively against Caleb's chest. "Lease terminated due to fraudulent funding and federal asset freeze," the man barked, his voice rough and completely devoid of sympathy. "Step away from the vehicle, kid, or I'll have the cops here in exactly 2 minutes to arrest you for obstruction." Caleb stared at the clipboard, the official bank seals blurring through his panicked, tear-filled eyes. He watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the men swiftly hooked the heavy chains to the undercarriage of his beloved sports car. "Please, you don't understand, it's a massive banking error," Caleb pleaded, grabbing the man's thick arm in a desperate, pathetic attempt to stop the repo. The man violently shoved Caleb backward, sending him slipping on the wet pavement and crashing hard onto his expensive, tailored knees. "Take it up with the feds, buddy," the driver sneered, climbing back into the cab of the massive truck. Within 60 seconds, the Porsche was lifted off the ground, the alarm blaring uselessly into the rainy street. Caleb sat in a muddy puddle on the sidewalk, watching his fake, stolen empire get towed away into the heavy morning traffic. He had no car, no penthouse, no money, and no escape from the federal trap closing tightly around his neck. He slowly pulled himself up from the gutter, his knees scraped and his pride completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. With his credit cards frozen and his cash seized, he couldn't even afford to call an Uber to take him home. He had to walk 3 miles in the freezing rain to his mother's suburban house, the only place he had left to hide. Meanwhile, back in Marcus's warm, mahogany-scented office, I watched the live GPS tracker of the Porsche moving steadily toward the impound lot. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee, feeling the exhaustion of the past 2 days finally begin to lift. "The car is secured," Marcus announced, closing the tracking window on his monitor. "And the bank just confirmed that the $200,000 wire transfer has been officially reversed and safely returned to the Decoy account." My money was safe, locked back in the heavily guarded vault where it belonged. But the financial recovery was only half of the justice I demanded for this absolute betrayal. Caleb needed to face the mother who had enabled his toxic, entitled behavior for his entire miserable life. Nora had always believed her son was a misunderstood genius, a victim of bad luck and jealous teachers. She needed to see the brutal, undeniable truth of what her precious boy had actually become. I picked up my phone and dialed Nora's number, knowing exactly what I was about to unleash on her quiet suburban morning. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful, completely oblivious to the hurricane heading straight for her front door. "Hi, Dad, how are you feeling this morning?" she asked, probably still riding the high of the lavish steakhouse dinner.
Well,
"Nora, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice heavy, serious, and completely stripped of the frail old man act. "Something terrible has happened, and Caleb is in severe legal trouble." The cheerful tone instantly vanished from her voice, replaced by the sharp, defensive panic of a fiercely protective mother. What are you talking about, Dad? Did someone hurt him? Is he in the hospital?" "No, Nora," I replied, letting the cold, hard reality of my words hang in the air for a second. "He's not in the hospital, but he might be going to federal prison." I heard her drop a glass in the background, the sharp shatter echoing through the phone line. "Caleb stole $450,000 from my retirement account to buy his fake tech lifestyle, and the FBI has just frozen all of his assets." I didn't give her a chance to scream, deny it, or make another pathetic excuse for him. "He is walking to your house right now, Nora. Ask him exactly where he got the money for the Porsche." I hung up the phone, leaving her alone with the shattered glass and the terrifying truth of her son's monumental betrayal. Chapter 7: The Shattered Glass. Nora stood frozen in her pristine suburban kitchen, staring at the shattered glass scattered across the expensive hardwood floor. My words echoed in her mind like a relentless, deafening siren, tearing through the carefully constructed illusion of her perfect family. She wanted to believe I was confused, that my old age had finally caused a severe paranoid delusion. Her precious Caleb, the boy she had defended against every teacher, every boss, and every consequence, couldn't possibly be a federal criminal. But deep down in the dark, quiet corners of her motherly intuition, she knew I was telling the absolute truth.
well,
She remembered how quickly Caleb had suddenly acquired his wealth, the vague answers about his tech startup, the arrogant smirk that never quite reached his eyes. 20 minutes later, the heavy oak front door violently swung open, slamming against the wall with a sickening thud. Nora rushed into the foyer and stopped dead in her tracks, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute horror. Caleb stood in the doorway, dripping wet, shivering violently, and looking like a feral, cornered animal. His custom Italian suit was ruined, covered in mud and street grime from his humiliating fall on the sidewalk. He didn't look like a self-made billionaire tech CEO anymore. He looked exactly like the pathetic, desperate thief he truly was. "Caleb, what happened to you? Where's your car?" Nora whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped toward him. Caleb avoided her eyes, staring at the floor as he aggressively pushed past her, heading straight for the liquor cabinet in the living room. "It's gone, Mom, okay? The stupid feds took it," he snapped, his voice cracking with a toxic mix of rage and absolute terror. He grabbed a bottle of expensive scotch, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unscrew the heavy glass cap. Nora followed him, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape. "Your grandfather called me, Caleb," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper she had never used with him before.
well,
Caleb froze, the bottle of scotch hovering inches from his lips, his eyes widening in sudden, paralyzing panic. "He said you stole his retirement money, all of it? Tell me he's confused, Caleb. Tell me right now that he is lying." Caleb slowly lowered the bottle, his shoulders slumping as the last fragile piece of his fake empire completely collapsed. He couldn't lie his way out of this one. The repo men, the frozen accounts, and the Federal Intercept message had already spoken for him. He didn't need it, Mom. Caleb suddenly screamed, whirling around to face her, his face twisted in an ugly, defensive snarl. He just sits in that dusty old house doing crossword puzzles. I was going to invest it. I was going to double it for him.
What?
Nora physically recoiled as if her own son had just slapped her hard across the face. He didn't deny it. He didn't even show a single ounce of remorse for leaving his grandfather destitute. He just stood there, dripping wet and reeking of entitlement, trying to justify a massive federal felony as a favor. You stole $450,000 from your own grandfather. Nora choked out, tears of absolute devastation finally spilling down her cheeks. I didn't steal it, I borrowed it to secure the penthouse. Caleb yelled back, slamming the heavy Scotch bottle down on the glass coffee table. If the stupid bank hadn't frozen the transfer, I would have paid him back eventually.
What?
The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of his statement finally shattered the last remaining blindfold Nora had worn for 24 years. She suddenly saw him not as her precious, misunderstood boy, but as the ruthless, manipulative parasite he had chosen to become. You are a monster, Nora whispered, the absolute disgust in her voice hitting Caleb harder than a physical blow. Mom, you have to help me, Caleb pleaded, his anger instantly evaporating into pathetic, desperate begging as he reached for her hands. They took the car, they froze my accounts, the FBI is going to arrest me, you have to talk to Grandpa, you have to make him drop the charges. Nora looked down at his trembling hands, the hands she had held, protected, and laid out of trouble for his entire life.
What?
She slowly pulled her hands away, stepping back and looking at him with a cold, unfamiliar emptiness in her eyes. I can't protect you from the federal government, Caleb, she said, her voice eerily calm and completely devoid of warmth. And even if I could, I wouldn't. Caleb stared at her, his mouth opening and closing in absolute shock, unable to comprehend that his ultimate safety net had just vanished. You stole from the man who worked in a steel mill for 45 years to feed us, Nora continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Get out of my house, Caleb, get out right now before I call the police myself. Caleb tried to argue, tried to cry, tried to manipulate her one last time, but Nora just pointed a trembling finger directly at the front door. He turned around, defeated, broken, and completely alone, walking back out into the freezing, unforgiving rain. He had nothing left, no money, no car, no family, and nowhere to hide from the federal agents who were already hunting him down. Chapter 8: The Spare Chain. 2 days after Caleb was thrown out of his mother's house, the federal agents finally caught up with him. He was hiding in a cheap, flea-infested motel on the outskirts of the city, paying for it with the last few crumpled dollar bills in his pocket. I wasn't there to see it, but Marcus had a contact at the precinct who gave us the incredibly satisfying details. They kicked the flimsy motel door off its hinges at 6 in the morning, dragging him out of bed in his stained underwear. He cried like a terrified child as they slapped the heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists, begging them to call his mother. But Nora never answered the phone, and I certainly wasn't going to bail him out.
What?
The trial was remarkably short, mostly because Caleb had left a digital paper trail so obvious it practically convicted him on the first day. His expensive public defender tried to argue that it was a simple family misunderstanding, a grandson trying to help his confused grandfather invest in the modern world. But the federal prosecutor played the recorded phone call where Caleb frantically begged me to lie to the FBI. The judge looked at him with absolute disgust, slamming the heavy wooden gavel down with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. Caleb was sentenced to 7 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud and elder financial abuse. As the bailiffs led him away in his bright orange jumpsuit, he looked back at me sitting in the gallery, his eyes pleading for a mercy he didn't deserve. I didn't smile, I didn't frown, I just adjusted my vintage glasses and walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. Before he was transferred to the main facility, I decided to pay him exactly one visit through the thick, reinforced glass of the county jail. He picked up the heavy plastic phone, looking pale, malnourished, and completely stripped of his arrogant tech bro persona. Why did you do this to me, Grandpa? He whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of anger and self-pity. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I didn't do anything to you, Caleb, I just let you do it to yourself, I replied calmly. But before I go, I want to tell you a little secret about the money you tried to steal. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes widening with a sudden, desperate curiosity. That $450,000 was just a decoy account I set up specifically to catch a thief, I whispered into the phone. My real fortune, the $8 million I made from commercial real estate, is sitting safely in an impenetrable blind trust. I watched the color completely drain from his face as the crushing weight of his monumental stupidity finally crashed down on him. He hadn't just ruined his life for my life savings, he had ruined his life for my spare change.
What?
I hung up the phone, turned my back on him, and walked out of the prison without ever looking back. It has been 6 months since that day, and my life has been incredibly peaceful. Nora and I have actually grown closer, spending our weekends gardening and repairing the damage her blind love had caused. She finally understands that true love sometimes means letting a toxic person face the brutal consequences of their own actions. As for me, I still live in my quiet little house, and I still drive my rusty old truck to the grocery store. People in town still look at me and see a frail, harmless old man living on a fixed income. But last week, I took a quiet trip to a private wealth management firm downtown. I sat in a plush leather chair, sipping a glass of 20-year-old scotch, and reviewed the portfolio of my blind trust. The $8 million had quietly grown to over $9.5 million thanks to the aggressive market. I decided to use a small fraction of it to anonymously pay off Nora's mortgage, ensuring she will never have to worry about a roof over her head again. Caleb thought he was the smartest person in the room, a brilliant predator hunting a weak, oblivious sheep. He never realized that the sheep was actually a wolf in disguise, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to snap its jaws shut. If there is one lesson you take away from my story, let it be this. Never underestimate the quiet ones, especially the ones who have spent their entire lives building a fortress you can't even see. Because when you try to steal a man's life's work, you might just trigger a trap you will never, ever escape.